Imagine finding a 2,000-year-old treasure map to a fortune worth millions of dollars. But no one can identify the markers. Are the riches real or simply a myth? Since its discovery, there's been nothing but controversy over a copper scroll found among the leather and papyrus of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But does what it contains amount to fact or fiction? Were Jerusalem's temple treasures hidden away in the desert for safekeeping? Does the copper scroll tell us where they can be found? And have any of the treasures listed in the scroll been recovered? With the discovery of the copper scroll, treasure hunters and archaeologists alike have searched for the vast riches described in this unique record, but this may not be the only treasure or even the greatest treasure to be found in the Holy Land. Some researchers believe that an even more fabulous fortune is buried beneath the city of Jerusalem, the treasure of King David's tomb. What kind of riches could be contained in this ancient burial place? Has any of it ever been found? Or does an ancient curse protect it from tomb raiders to this very day? And what would happen to the nation of Israel if either of these fabulous treasures were found within its borders? Would it solidify the Jews' claim to Jerusalem and the Holy Land? Or would it be the catalyst for all-out war? The secrets of the Copper Scroll and the treasures of the Second Temple are about to be revealed. We are about to look through the pages of the first continuous recorded history of mankind in the book we call the Holy Bible, as we continue our investigation into some of its most controversial stories and try to answer some very tough questions. Is the Bible a reliable account of miraculous interventions, of angels, apostles, and the power of prayer? Or is it just a collection of stories and myth, as some modern-day critics suggest? Both Bible skeptics and proponents from around the world have contributed to this exciting discussion. Some of these biblical revelations may shock and surprise you. In 1947, a young shepherd tending his flock in the hills above the Dead Sea made what is perhaps the most significant archaeological discovery of all time, purely by accident. He threw a rock into the mouth of one of the many caves that dot the rugged terrain. The sound of pottery shattering caught his attention, so he climbed inside the cave and discovered the first group of what would come to be known as the Dead Sea Scrolls.
The Dead Sea Scrolls date back almost 2,000 years, back to the time when the Jewish temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. The scrolls were written on either papyrus or leather and were stored in clay jars that were deposited into caves. They were found in the vicinity of the ancient settlement called Qumran near the Dead Sea. And they include both secular writings and religious texts, things like hymn books, biblical commentaries, two of the oldest known copies of the book of Isaiah, and fragments of almost every book in the Old Testament.
The curiosity of the world was ignited with the discovery of the first cache of scrolls. In the years to come, more and more of these ancient manuscripts, some 800 in all, would be discovered in and around the area of Qumran. Then, in 1952, the most unusual scroll of all was brought to light, engraved on a 23-foot-long sheet of pure copper. Its text contained a list of treasures that had been split up and hidden in 64 different locations. Archaeologists were astounded and curious. Was this the find of a lifetime or an ancient hoax?
Tales about buried treasure have been around for forever. So let's say there was a hoard of silver and gold being hidden from the Romans. This copper scroll was probably just made up to throw everybody else off. while the makers of the scroll could have easily just taken off with everything themselves.
The similarity in the writing and materials used for most of the Dead Sea Scrolls leads archaeologists to believe they came from the same sources. The most likely scenario is they were copied down by members of a Jewish sect called the Essenes, who once lived in the area of Qumran. But the Copper Scroll stands out from the others for two reasons. It's not written in narrative form like the other text. It's a list, pure and simple. A list of what many believed to be treasures from the Second Jewish Temple that were hidden in order to prevent them from falling into the hands of the Romans. The second thing that sets the Copper Scroll apart is it's the only one of the Dead Sea Scrolls that was not written on papyrus or leather. Instead, it was inscribed onto sheets of copper using a technique called bas relief. As we can see from this replica of the Copper Scroll, letters were hammered into the backside of the metal using a punch. This resulted in a raised letter text that showed through to the front side of the scroll. A tremendous amount of effort went into the making of this scroll, and I think that gives us a good indication that the Copper Scroll is a real treasure map. The Essenes knew that the list was of great importance, so they reasoned that by leaving this record on sheets of metal, it would have a greater chance of surviving the elements so that the treasure could one day be retrieved.
2,000 years have passed since the writing of the Copper Scroll. During that time, the Jews were scattered throughout the world and the treasure was lost in the sands of time. Lost, but not forgotten. Modern-day treasure hunters and archaeologists would like nothing better than to rediscover these fabled riches. Has the time come for this lost Bible treasure to be revealed? Or are the hopeful looking for something that simply doesn't exist?
Israel's a small country, and there isn't much about the temple period and where everything was back then that we don't already know. If there was anything to this Copper Scroll treasure map and whatever it talks about, we would have known about it long before now.
J.T. Millick was the first scholar to publish a translation of the text of the Copper Scroll, and in his opinion the list contained in the scroll was nothing more than Jewish religious folklore. He based that belief on what he took to be parallel accounts of hidden treasure in the ancient Jewish literature. The best example of this parallel comes from a medieval Jewish midrash. These were commentaries on the Hebrew scriptures that were known to have been based on Jewish legend and parables. Millick believed this particular midrash provided an interpretive key to the Copper Scroll because it contains the story about the hiding of the temple treasures in secret underground compartments. The location of these places would not be known until the coming of the Messiah. The midrash also says that the inventory of the temple treasures was written on a copper tablet. Based on the obvious connection between the Copper Scroll and the midrash, which again Millick believed to be purely legend, he discounted the authenticity of the scroll.
Are the contents of the Copper Scroll simply a bare-bones retelling of Jewish legend? It would seem that the conclusions of such a noted scholar are hard to argue with. But could there be an ulterior motive for publicly stating the treasure is a hoax? Roland DeVoe, a Catholic scholar involved in the translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls, had this to say about the purported treasure map. If we give any credence at all to the Copper Scroll, it will be an invitation to treasure hunters from everywhere to descend on the caves of Qumran and destroy any archaeological investigations that might be properly done.
When the Copper Scroll was discovered, the Qumran area was under the administration of the Kingdom of Jordan. And I think Roland DeVoe and J.T. Millick and the others who were involved in the analysis of the Copper Scroll were feeling tremendous pressure from the government to keep this thing quiet. The last things the Jordanians wanted was a group of amateur treasure hunters tearing through the countryside. But there's also the fear that if they found anything, that they might try to illegally export it from Jordan.
Jordan maintained a very tight control over the search for any of the Copper Scroll treasures because they wanted to avoid a conflict with the state of Israel, whose Jewish forefathers had hidden the treasure. At that time, Jordan did not recognize the existence of the Jewish state, and a claim by Israel over the treasure would force it to legally acknowledge Israel as plaintiff. This was something they desperately wanted to avoid. The Jordanians also feared an army of treasure hunters descending upon the desert to loot valuable artifacts.
The Jordanians' fear of treasure hunters was not unfounded. In the years that followed the publication of the Copper Scroll, a number of excavations took place. Both amateurs and professionals used the Copper Scroll as a guide.
The first and most notable search for the Copper Scroll treasure occurred in the early 1960s. It was undertaken by a man named John Allegro, a respected scholar who had come up with his own translation of the scroll and submitted it to the Jordanian government. With the official blessing of Jordan, Allegro searched for the buried treasure, but found nothing. At least that's what we have to assume, since no official report was published about the secret excavations.
Word gets around in the archaeological community, and so it was well known that John Allegro's search for the Copper Scroll treasure turned up nothing. But what's really interesting is the fact that the Jordanian government, which had been so adamant about the treasure being a fake, allowed someone to search for it at all.
If the Jordanian government believed that the contents of the scroll were legend, why would they support an official search for the treasure? Did Jordan deliberately mislead the public in order to keep outsiders at bay? Perhaps the leaders of this small country held out hope that a vast treasure might be found within their borders, but it was not to be. Does this mean that the Copper Scroll is, indeed, a fraud? Or could it be that the scroll itself represents only half of a two-part treasure map? And if so, where is the missing piece?
In the closing lines of the Copper Scroll, we find a notation about another secret scroll, which contains details that are crucial in the locating of the treasure. The text reads, "In the tunnel which is in Sakhab, to the north of Khaklit, a copy of this text and its explanation and its measurements and the inventory, item by item." J.T. Millick believed that the duplicate was in fact a longer, more detailed version of the list contained in the Copper Scroll, and that the Copper Scroll was meant only to contain the essential details, not enough to actually find the treasure unless you knew where it had been buried in the first place.
Is the long-lost sister to the Copper Scroll lying buried somewhere in the desert just waiting to be discovered? Could the secret scroll be found based on the description of its location given in the Copper Scroll? And if it were found, would this key unlock the mystery of where the treasures are buried?
The Copper Scroll tells us that its companion is buried in the tunnel in Sakhab. But where's Sakhab? That's difficult to determine because the place names and markers have changed since ancient times. The most likely location is a place called Tel Shihab, to the far east of the Sea of Galilee and close to the remains of the old Roman road to Damascus. Most archaeologists believe that the Essenes had a settlement in Damascus that was significant enough to have its own kokhlit or monastery. So it may well be that that second scroll is still hidden where it was buried 2,000 years ago. And as far as we know, no one's found it. And that means no one's found the treasure either.
Then in 1988, a discovery in the caves above Qumran sparked a renewed interest in the Copper Scroll. Had a piece of the treasure been found? And does this mean archaeologists are on the brink of discovering the entire treasure trove? Or might their attention be diverted to an even more fabulous lode of riches? For much of its history, the Copper Scroll and its list of buried treasures has been hidden away, first in a cave near the Dead Sea, and then after its discovery in 1952, it landed in a museum in Jordan. But the Copper Scroll would take center stage once again when an amateur archaeologist and treasure hunter made an incredible discovery. In 1964, a man named Vendell Jones started looking for some of the items mentioned in the Copper Scroll. He spent more than 20 years searching for any sign of the treasure with no luck. Until 1988, when his excavation team found a small earthen vessel in a cave near Qumran.
Numerous articles from the Second Temple are recorded on the Copper Scroll, including such specific items as the breastplate of the high priest, various treasures of both gold and silver, various plates that were used in the temple worship, and, most interesting of all, the oil of anointing, a flask made of clay that would hold the oil that was used to anoint the tabernacle, to anoint the Ark of the Covenant, and the high priest himself.
The juglet that Jones found was filled with a dark liquid substance. Analysis of the contents showed that it was a sweet-smelling oil. Jones immediately announced to the media that he'd found the sacred anointing oil of the Copper Scroll. If the anointing oil has indeed been found, the ramifications are enormous. A new temple can be built and anointed in Jerusalem, an event that, according to ancient prophecy, is a sign of the end times. But has the composition of the oil been firmly established, or are there still some lingering doubts?
You know, it's one thing to find a small container and say that it may or may not have contained oil, but to say that it definitely contained oil that came from the Second Temple, I mean, that kind of seems like a stretch. Even with today's modern scientific methods, identifying something biological that's been buried for over 2,000 years, it doesn't seem very reliable.
When Vendell Jones announced to the media that he'd discovered one of the treasures listed on the copper scroll, he made the front page of the New York Times. But the discovery, in fact, is not what Mr. Jones claimed. Jones claimed that the oil was analyzed and had been proven to be the anointing oil as described in Exodus chapter 30. That's simply not the case. The oil was analyzed by the Casale Institute for Applied Chemistry at the Hebrew University, and those tests proved one thing conclusively. The contents of the juglet cannot be the holy anointing oil of the temple because it contains no olive oil. Anyone who's read the biblical text can see that olive oil is one of the main ingredients in the holy anointing oil. The analysis revealed that the oil is from the right time period, but it's not the anointing oil listed in the copper scroll, but a balsam oil that was used for perfume.
The controversy over the copper scroll will undoubtedly continue, as will the hunt for its treasure. But in a land so filled with history and intrigue, there's bound to be more than one lode of riches to pursue. According to tradition, this mosque is built over the tomb of the great Israelite leader King David. However, most experts agree that the real tomb is not located here, but is hidden somewhere beneath the city of Jerusalem. Legend has it that when David was buried by his son Solomon, an immense fortune in gold and silver was buried with him. Some say that as much as 375 tons of gold are buried with the king beneath the foundations of this ancient city. A fortune so vast that, if found, it could change the course of history. Where did all these riches come from? And are they still there, just waiting to be discovered?
The treasure of the copper scroll is believed to have come from the Second Temple. But the wealth of King David came from the silver and gold that was gathered in order to build and furnish the First Temple. According to our best estimates, only a portion of those riches were actually necessary to complete the temple. The rest, it seems, was possibly stored away in David's tomb, according to burial instructions David gave to Solomon before he died.
Why would the treasure that David had amassed for purposes of outfitting the temple wind up in his tomb? People would wonder why that would occur. But there's a very logical answer. David was a forward-thinking individual. He was conservative in his outlook. He always depended upon prophecy. He would not make decisions unless he knew what God's will was. Also, you find that his son Solomon gave instruction that a wise man saves up for his children and his children's children. This means that that is a forward-looking approach. And if you were to take the total amount of treasure, the 100,000 talents of gold, the 1,000,000 talents of silver, and the amount of gold necessary to outfit a small Hebrew temple, which would be anywhere from, depending on the size of a talent now, about 3% to 10% of the total mass of gold that David had accumulated was necessary for outfitting the temple. Now, this is based upon the principle that the Temple of Delphi had 127 tons of gold used in its construction, and it was far richer than the Temple of Jerusalem. So when you take that perspective, David was able to save upwards of up to about 90% of the gold that he had amassed for future generations. So this is based upon a forward-thinking king.
But is it just the gold? Or is there another reason why Christians are interested in David's tomb?
For many years, critics of the Bible argued that the only evidence for King David was the Bible stories themselves. In fact, some critics argued that a lack of archaeological evidence proved that David didn't exist at all. It was a shock to these critics when an inscription was discovered in 1993 commemorating the victory of the king of Damascus over the house of David, in effect solidifying David's place in biblical history. The discovery of David's tomb would establish the Bible as valid secular history, as well as a chronicle of God's dealing with his children. The discovery of treasure would be of secondary importance.
It's not just the monetary treasure like the silver and gold, which would be enormous in itself, but David's tomb, to be opened, would have in it undoubtedly the archive, the missing archive of Israel, which has never been located. Also, the king of Israel was required to write his own copy of the law, the book of Deuteronomy at least, and writing the complete Torah in his own handwriting, that could exist in the tomb. There could be other artifacts, such as the helmet of Goliath, the spear of Goliath, David's own shield, any number of things. The tomb could not only be a sanctuary or a treasury, but it could also double for being a museum and it's symbolic as well. The statement that Josephus made in regards to David, he claimed that David was the richest of all kings. And the fact that we know now historically and that Alexander the Great had seized around 7,000 tons of gold. Josephus certainly knew of Alexander. He certainly knew of David. Therefore, he was comparing David to Alexander. Nobody knows where King David's tomb is located today. And according to the Jewish historian Josephus, that's exactly the way David wanted it. According to his account, David's tomb was so artfully constructed that it remained hidden from view. And as it turned out, that is a good thing. Because of the hidden nature of the tomb and treasure, this is what allowed it to remain secret until this very time.
Could it be that the treasure of King David's tomb has been lost for thousands of years? If so, its discovery would be even more important than the unearthing of the magnificent burial place of King Tut. However, ancient documents indicate that grave robbers may have already looted David's burial site. But according to the record, these were not your everyday treasure hunters.
According to Josephus, the tomb of David had been disturbed twice in its history, once for necessity and the last time for greed. The first occasion came around 150 years before the birth of Christ, and this was when Antiochus, the king of Syria, came down to Jerusalem and besieged the city. And in order to get rid of him, Hyrcanus the high priest went down into King David's tomb and extracted 3,000 talents of silver, paid the ransom, and then Antiochus left. But the second time David's tomb was disturbed, things didn't end so peacefully. Now Herod the Great, who was king of Jerusalem in the time Jesus was born, decided to extract some of the gold out of King David's tomb. So he sent his own men down into the tomb to extract some of the wealth.
As Herod's men attempted to open the tomb, a blast of flame filled the chamber and drove them back. 2 of Herod's guards were killed, and the other soldiers were so frightened by the experience they refused to re-enter the tomb, even under the penalty of death.
This account, reported by Josephus, of Herod and his men going into David's tomb, had one unfortunate experience. Herod locked down the tomb, closed it down, and put a monument outside to ensure that no one would come this way again.
What happened to the treasure of David's lost tomb? Did future generations respect Herod's warning and stay clear of the king's final resting place? Or did the unstoppable force of the Roman Empire sweep it away long ago?
In the written histories of the first and second Jewish revolts, we find no reference to treasure being plundered from David's tomb. But if that had been the case, there surely would have been some reporting of this. The other piece of evidence comes from the Arch of Titus in Rome. The purpose of the arch was to celebrate Rome's sacking of Jerusalem, and we can see in the carvings that some items from the temple, like the menorah, were looted. But there's no depiction of treasure being extracted from David's tomb.
If the Romans had retrieved the immense stockpile of gold from David's tomb, wouldn't they have celebrated their achievement? Can we assume, then, that the treasure is still buried beneath Jerusalem? If so, what would we find if the riches were uncovered today?
It's hard to contemplate the magnitude. First of all, what it would do is cause historians, archaeologists, theologians to recognize the validity of King David. It would probably cause a resurgence in Torah studies, because it would be important to recognize how the dominating factor in David's life was the Torah. He followed God. It would be a more God-fearing world as a result of it.
I think the real riches would be archaeological, because we would be discovering more confirmation of what occurred during the life of Jesus and more confirmation of what happened in Old Testament Jewish history. All of this is a wealth of information for both Christians and Jews, and confirming the validity of the book that we consider to have been inspired by God.
If that treasure was found today, Israel would be wealthy beyond its wildest dreams. But of course, there'd be a lot of controversy over that treasure. The Palestinians have made it clear that they believe Jerusalem belongs to them, so if a treasure was found buried beneath the city, they would undoubtedly claim ownership of it. It's possible that a discovery of such vast wealth could send the region into turmoil, even more so than there is today, possibly even all-out war.
Will the treasures of the Copper Scroll and King David's tomb ever be found? Only time will tell. Meanwhile, archaeologists and treasure hunters alike will undoubtedly continue to search for these ancient riches. But perhaps at this point, it might be better for everyone if these lost Bible treasures remain lost.